Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I'm Layli Mapayan. I'm the Executive Director of the Wellesley Centers for Women, and it's wonderful to see a room full of you today, particularly imagining what you might have had to tear yourself away from to be here, to be with us as we launch the Documenting Our History project of the Wellesley Centers for Women as we move towards our 50th anniversary. Now that's a ways away at this point, but if you know anything about doing history, you know that it takes time to do a good history and you have to start well ahead of time. So we've started, and we're going to begin the program, but before we do so, I want to introduce someone very important, someone who is part of the reason that we're even able to have this celebration, and someone who is in fact very historic with regard to Wellesley College, and that is President Paula Johnson. Paula Johnson, yes, that's right, applause is worthy. Paula A. Johnson is the 14th president of Wellesley College. She is a highly respected and passionate leader, deeply committed to women and to sustainably improving their lives. She also has a strong and long connection to women's research centers and is recognized internationally as an innovator who has brought her broad range of experience as a researcher, educator, and expert in healthcare, public health, and health policy to bear in the effort to advance the well-being of women. With a remarkable track record of accomplishments, she founded the Connors Center for Women's Health and Gender Biology at Brigham and Women's Hospital. She has led in the field of women's health, taking an approach to biology that integrates insights from sociology, economics, and many other fields. You can see why she's such a friend of WCW, that interdisciplinarity. Before taking the helm at Wellesley, President Johnson was the Grace A. Young Family Professor of Medicine and Women's Health at Harvard Medical School, as well as Professor of Epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Her research, her vision, and her interdisciplinary approach to leading at the intersection of healthcare, education, and public health have placed her in key leadership roles in organizations around the world. It is our pleasure and honor to have her open our program today.
Layli, thank you for that kind and lovely introduction, and for all that you and your team have done to make today possible. It's wonderful to look out at all of you here in the audience. I am so delighted to welcome all of you to this very special lunchtime seminar, Wellesley Centers for Women in Retrospect, with two extremely important and special guests, Barbara Newell, who served as the 10th president of Wellesley College, and National Public Radio Senior National Correspondent, Linda Wertheimer, Wellesley class of 1965. So as Layli said, today's program kicks off a multi-year celebration of the first 50 years, and I would say the first, looking to the second, 50 years of the Wellesley Centers for Women, which will culminate in 2024. Now, 6 years may seem like a long time to celebrate, but when I think of all that the centers have accomplished, it will hardly be long enough. All of this can be directly traced to Barbara Newell's prescience and vision. An economist and a strong advocate for women, Barbara Newell served as Wellesley's president from 1972 to 1980, and she would go on to become the first woman to serve as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and the first woman to serve as the chancellor of the State University System of Florida. Truly a testament to the values she both championed and embodied. As Wellesley's president, Barbara Newell's notable accomplishments included this expansion and integration of science facilities. She was the person who worked to construct the Science Center, what we call today as the L Wing. And for those of you in here who are science, you know that right now the L Wing is gutted, and we are doing a renovation, Barbara, and it will be beautiful and so up to date. So you really built that foundation. But most significantly for today, she worked to found the Wellesley Center for Research on Women in Higher Education and the Professions, and later simply the Center for Research on Women. It was established in 1974, and the center evolved and grew over the next 2 decades. In a 1995 merger with the Stone Center for Development Services and Studies, created in 1981, it further expanded the reach of what we know today as the Wellesley Centers for Women, a truly wonderful, powerful, integrated research center. Looking back to the early days of WCW, I'm truly struck by the parallels between then and now. The sense of living in a moment when everything is at stake. And I think, as Layli said, it is, I think, particularly just remarkable that we are here today on a day when what is happening in our country would be hard to believe, but only clarifies the need for the Wellesley Centers for Women and Wellesley College. Now as then, yes. Now as then, women are taking to the streets to fight for their human rights. In the historic Women's March of 2017, I see echoes of the historic Women's Strike for Equality March of 1970. Now as then, we know that history is in the making and that the world needs women at the forefront of making history. In the record numbers of women running for office this year, in the fierce activism of Me Too, Time's Up, and in intersectionality, I see the ongoing evolution of the second wave of feminism. And now as then, there's a need for evidence-based research to guide the vast energies unleashed into the world. As a physician, as a scientist, this perspective is central to how I think about work, and I am so thrilled to have an ally and true inspiration in WCW. Just as today's feminists stand on the shoulders of past generations, so does today's WCW rest on the foundation of those who brought it into being. So as we seek to understand that history, we could have no better guide than Barbara Newell herself. And as we seek to grasp what history means, we could have no better guide than Linda Wertheimer, who is here to offer context and commentary. For those of you who listen to NPR, and actually who doesn't listen to NPR, Linda needs little introduction, but just a few words to set the stage. Linda joined NPR in 1971, just as it hit the air. She went on to serve as its first director of All Things Considered, which she also hosted from 1989 to 2002. In her current role, she has traveled the country and the world reporting on current events. And among her many distinctions, she was the first woman to anchor the coverage of a presidential nomination convention and of election night, and is the recipient of numerous awards and honors. Throughout, Linda has continued to share her gifts with Wellesley. She's been a former Wellesley College alumna trustee, and she currently serves as a member of the WCW Council of Advisors. We are so grateful, Linda, for your ongoing support, and we are so thrilled to have you back on campus. So now I'm delighted to turn things over to Layli, who will moderate and interview these two amazing women. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, President Johnson, for that really wonderful summary of what this moment is about. And I want to just really acknowledge the fact that all of you are here to begin this celebration with us. We're calling this initiative a half century of social change, because by the time we get to that 50th anniversary, it will be a half century of social change. I want to talk a little bit about why we chose to launch this initiative with this particular event. As President Johnson already noted, President Newell was the one whose brainchild was the Wellesley Centers for Women. She was the one that recognized that that was the moment to make Wellesley College a leader in the kinds of research that would advance the women's movement. And when I met her and had a chance to talk with her early in my time as leading the Wellesley Centers for Women, I was really impressed by her audacity and her vision, because at the particular moment that Wellesley College was at that time, pivoting between the changes of the late 60s and early 70s, but being positioned institutionally as a relatively conservative place, because most institutions are conservative relative to the rest of society, she was imagining a mechanism that could catapult not just Wellesley College forward, but society forward because of what the Wellesley Centers for Women would put out. And on that note, I want to acknowledge the fact that in addition to Linda Wertheimer, we have a number of our Council of Advisors members here who serve as that ambassadorial interface between the Wellesley Centers for Women and the larger society. Can those of you who are here raise your hands just so people can look around and see a few of you in the room? We have more who are arriving later tonight. And I also want to acknowledge that two of my predecessors who led the Wellesley Centers for Women before me are also in the room. Susan Bailey, who immediately preceded me. Raise your hand, Susan. There you are. And I also want to acknowledge Carolyn Elliott, who was the very first director for the Center for Research on Women, who is also with us today. What I think is really remarkable in the opportunity of our conversation today is that we really have three people sitting here who represent three generations of this process of evolution, not only of the Wellesley Centers for Women, but also of the larger women's movement. Linda Wertheimer, when I spoke with her, said, I can remember what it was like to be a student here in the 60s, what that context was like. And in the oral history that we did with Barbara Newell earlier in the summer, she talked a lot about how her own life and career were progressing during that period that made her the person who said, this is how I'm going to make this important social change intervention. And so I actually want to begin with a question to President Newell that is, how would you describe the climate for women in the early 1970s, both in the general public and in higher education, and how it affected your own life and work and decision to found the Wellesley Centers for Women, or then the Center for Research on Women?
I'm curious to see how Linda will footnote this, but my first answer would be it was an exciting time. One had a sense of absolutely the world, all the doors were opening up simultaneously. There was a chance to really talk about every soul's development to their full potential. The real chance to have choices and how the family, how the work life, what your direction was going to be as a human being. Earlier, as I grew up, I just assumed I would be married. I just assumed I would have 4 children. I assumed I would live in the suburbs. And so did everybody else around me. And the 1960s and 70s really began to say there should be individual choice, and that all, depending on their abilities, should have a chance to get ahead. This was true in much of academia. Certainly it was true in the student body. And to me, one of the exciting things was it penetrated a much larger scope of Americans, in my sense. Whether it was blue-collar workers or the trade union movement was still very much a part of this, and many joined that excitement. So there was a sense of breadth of societal involvement. Would you agree?
I do agree. One of the things that, of course, was huge in the 70s was the Supreme Court decision in 1974 that gender was, which gave life to the language of the Civil Rights Act, which included gender. Now, as I'm sure anybody who's studied this knows, when the members of the United States Senate included gender in the Civil Rights Act as something that you could not be discriminated against on account of gender, that was viewed as a poison pill. That members of the Senate were quite confident that the thing would fall because, and it was introduced by a Southerner who wanted it to fall. However, that reckoned without Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was, however he may have felt in his heart about it, it was going to happen. He had promised all of the Kennedy voters that he would carry this through, and he did, and it passed, but it rolled around in the courts for another number of years. So 1974 was the year that everybody said, okay, here we go. And
well, the excitement of that, just to build on it, is I happened to be sitting as the only woman in the higher administration of the University of Michigan. And they chose to sue the University of Michigan under the Title IX.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, I found myself spending the next 3 years trying to figure out what the full impact was. From everything from, could women swim in the swimming pool after 6 a.m.? Could women walk on the football field of the University of Michigan? And why was the graduate faculty of the English department predominantly women, but they never found a faculty member who could meet the requirements of the department? It covered absolute. I really should have started that women could not walk through the front door of the student union. And I myself, as a small girl, got told to walk around the building. We needed that. And it had it made every institution in the country begin to look at accepted practice. And that's why I started out with this sense of optimism of what might happen.
You know, there's an interesting book about called "When the Good Girls Revolt." It was written by a Vassar graduate, class of '65, who was the daughter of her name has gone out of my head. Anyway, she wrote a wonderful book about what happened with sort of at ground level after the court decision, which was that Newsweek, which had been sued, Newsweek was carrying the case. Newsweek, which had been sued, said, okay, instead of hiring young men as junior reporters and young women as researchers, everybody's a junior reporter. So they changed it. I mean, in just a very short period of time, all of that changed. So I think that was huge. It was very exciting. I was working at the time for public radio. Public radio did not really discriminate against women in quite the same way as other institutions did, because they couldn't afford it. Women were cheaper, and there were a lot of women on staff. There were, Susan Stamberg and I came along very early, and Cokie Roberts and Nina Totenberg, and the staff there are a tremendous number of women working there now, still. And one of the guys who worked temporarily as a boss on the weekend, I said, does it feel different to you than it did when you were working at the New York Times? He said, oh my God. But those were, just to graduate in 1965, I went, thanks to Wellesley, to London for a couple of years to work for the BBC and kind of learn my trade, and then came back. In those years, there were many things that were happening that were working for women. The economy was moving at quite a rapid clip. You didn't have a problem getting a job. You had a problem getting the job you wanted, but you didn't have a problem getting a job, keeping body and soul together. That was happening. And when I went to work for NPR, at first I went to work for WCBS News Radio, which just changed. And I had a real blinding insight that if you go to work for something that's brand new, that doesn't have any traditions about who does what, that's good for women. So, you know, all these startups are a good example of that. But I went to work for WCBS News Radio when it changed over. There were 2 women news reporters. They were at that time required to cut themselves out of their pieces and give the, you know, the analysis and text to be read by the newsreader, the anchor. And, you know, there they were, 2 of them. Mary Pan Gallows was one of them. I mean, a meaner woman you have never met. Mary Pan Gallows was at the front of every, you know, line she ever got in. And she was just amazing. And I kept thinking that she was, you know, that this couldn't last, that she can't put her name. Anyway, when I went to work for NPR, that was Frank Mankiewicz, who was at one point president of NPR, said to us one day that, he said, you know, we have a lot of women, I know that. He said, but I can't really take credit for it. Women, there's more bang for the buck there. Because, you know, public radio was very poor, paid very low salaries. And if you wanted to, you know, if you wanted to really, to hire talented people, you had to hire quite a few women. Or I suppose independently wealthy men. Anyway, it was a whole new world, and I was working in it was a very soft landing for me. I mean, that was fabulous. I did not have quite the same experience that many other women did have, but it was so amazing. You could just feel the rumbling, you know, rolling along changes that were happening, and you know, as always happens when the economy fluctuates and the numbers of jobs go down, then women's fortunes fall farther than men's do. But then it comes back.
You both have done a great job of setting the stage for that historical moment from different perspectives. I'd love to focus the story back in on that moment, President Newell, when you decided, I'm going to found this research center at Wellesley College. Obviously one of the leading women's colleges, if not the leading women's college of the time. Can you talk about what it was like to bring it into being, what you faced in creating it, and how you were able to secure its existence under your administration? Can you tell that story?
I'm delighted to have a chance to tell the story, but the real actors in the saga are right here in the room. Carolyn Elliott was a key to giving a sense of the quality and direction of the institution. And Susan Bailey was there as a major shift occurred in the integration of 2 centers on campus. Mm-hmm. So, and as I also told you, I had a dream, to quote someone, and my objective was to try to get the funding and the base started, but these are the people who really made it happen. So now I'll tell you all I did. But really, in a way, I was worried about the lack of an intellectual database for what we were doing. We were talking about affirmative action, but we didn't quite know how do you really run a personnel office to make the thing happen. We didn't know who was in which fields. We had a pretty good idea, but people didn't really sit down and analyze the data that we did have. Having watched, and I was very active at the University of Wisconsin in the establishment of a center that was working on how do we get an intellectual base for our research and program in the area of poverty. And I found that to do that, you had to bring people of different disciplines together. And it was exciting, for example, to find that the economists who said the biggest body of poor people in the state are living in Milwaukee, and the home economists who've been working on nutrition and farm families didn't know the nutritional value of kale, didn't know patterns of life of the African Americans and other Southerners who'd come up. And they started talking, and there was the service delivered in Milwaukee, in part thanks to having people, intellectuals, sit down and talk and try to make sure that what they worked on got put into the field. As the excitement of the 70s came along, and as you say, I was involved there in Michigan, I was hoping that maybe we could learn some of the lessons from this other drill in a community that would be very supportive. Now, this really goes back to an observation, I think it is accurate, that interest in women's concerns go up and down. Issues change over time. And one of the main functions of a women's college, in my mind, is to be a reservoir of both talent and information and direction for how one gets change. Back in my days when I was an undergraduate at Vassar, I used to go to a little room behind the checkout counter when I had finished my obligations of the day and read from the books. This whole room was dedicated to books that were published by graduates, the history of the women's colleges, and information on social causes, like the women's colleges were very instrumental in the problem of getting the vote. And I went back to look at that piece of history, and that was sort of how I cut my teeth as an undergraduate. Well, I remembered that. I came from the Wisconsin Poverty Center and the like. And when Wellesley came calling and asked if I would like to be president, this is really when I said, you know, it would make sense to see if we can get a base that will endure over time and meet the problems as they come up. And one of the things that happened is that I didn't realize it, but the Wellesley faculty had voted, not unanimously, but had voted to go co-ed, and the trustees did not wish to go co-ed. I obviously had a bias on this comment, and I think they hoped I could follow through on this bias. I'm really saying I think this is a major argument for the preservation of women's colleges. We need this kind of base over a long period of time. Not just in the United States, but I'm delighted to see that we're beginning to have a sort of an international flavor to much of what we do, because there's very real need in the international level. But at any rate, that's the dream I came to. We did get a grant. We did get grants. I have a piece of paper. This grant was $195,000. And it was aided and abetted by members of the women's professional caucuses from the different disciplines. And it was designed to try to be this reservoir of data and information and to bring disciplines together. I had hoped that we would find ourselves with links into the college campus so that it would affect what was really going on in the classroom as well. As I look at it over time, thanks to Carolyn, thanks to Susan and others, we can say, for example, that much of the basic work done in the child care area, the preschool area, really, it was good. It was there when it was needed in terms of legislation. As an administrator in Florida, I think my greatest moment was sitting in the back of an audience and listening to a member of the Women's Center come talk about curriculum development for the state of Florida and how it can be friendly to women and minorities. And that was really a statement of the research base that had come out of Wellesley. So I thank those who made my dream really come to a reality. I can take no credit for what really happened in the field.
I really like how you've sort of drawn out two things that are really in the DNA of that seed that you planted, if you want to characterize it that way. One is the power of convening thinkers and actors from different arenas in order to facilitate their translation of research into action. You know, and for those of you who know the Wellesley Centers for Women, our motto is shaping a better world through research and action. And it isn't always conventional for academic institutions to have such an outward-facing edge that has as its mission actually facilitating social movement and social change in an equitable direction. But that was, in fact, what you established. I think another thing that you perhaps have alluded to but didn't elaborate on that the audience might be interested in, if you don't already know, is that there was sort of a corollary movement going on around the country with other academic institutions also setting up women and gender-focused research centers at the time with a similar kind of objective. In some cases, it purely was curricular, with this notion that, oh, the canons have not included women. We've got to have research by and about women that puts women back in the curriculum. But at other times, recognizing the power of data to shoot academic information back out into the places where it's needed, whether in hearings, expert testimony, whether in the minds of policymakers who are making decisions, or in the hands of practitioners or others, or even back into academia itself, where much of the research that was produced by people at the Center for Research on Women, the Stone Center, and now the Wellesley Center for Women, found its way back into curricula and subsequently transformed them. So I think it's important to position that work that you did and think about the long arc of the way that it played out. I'd be curious to hear from both of you how you view the success of those movements, their different component parts. I know that today on a lot of people's minds is the question of how successful has the women's movement been? Of course, we see successes, but we also see areas where we're dealing with the same kinds of issues that we have dealt with since the beginning of time. So I'm sort of asking two questions at once. What are your own thoughts about how successful this movement that we've all participated in has been, but also what can we learn from the workings of these women and gender-focused research centers in terms of how they play a unique role in making that movement happen?
Shall I start? I would say that the Centers for Research into various kinds of women's issues that I am most familiar with after this one would be like Rutgers and the University of Missouri in St. Louis, which both had centers which study women in politics. and both of them have a very sort of active outreach in which they bring in women and they train them for politics, and they train them for not only for running, but, as is critically important and always neglected, for governing. Women are actually pretty good at governing, I think. But I think that has been very interesting, and it has been successful. If you look at the women who have, who have achieved, say, a statewide office, you'll find that a lot of them have had some sort of reference to these centers and to the work they do. And of course, it's that old thing about how you get a critical mass. If you have enough women in the legislature, then the legislature will pass certain kinds of laws which will advance and they will turn for research on what to do and how to do it to the people who've got the information. Women are so much more likely to consider that other people might have a good idea than I find, in politics at least, that men are. And so that has been, I think, a very helpful thing. And that's one of the things that I followed in the course of my work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm delighted that my daughter doesn't even discuss some of the issues that I had. She, particularly in the area of what am I going to do with my life? What kind of choices am I going to make? And I pray that continues on this momentous day. I'm delighted to see people who can tear themselves away from television. But to me, the primary issue is, are we going to go back to debate some of the very basic issues? When I got married in 1952, I had to act illegally in the state of Massachusetts to get birth control from my doctor. He was a nice guy who'd taken care of me since I was a small brat. But we went to the room and it was all very secret, and by glory, I got serviced. I wonder about people who didn't have that good old family doctor. And the debate was birth control. When you start getting testimony that debates between abortion and birth control pills, God help us. I think the women, the legislators, might be able to help. But I think there are a lot of critical issues on the line at this particular moment. And the power of the Supreme Court to go back on the civil rights issues that got passed for everybody, not just women. Though there are a number of crucial issues that are on the line at the moment. The labor movement went from 1937 back to 1928 in one decision by the Supreme Court this last year. I really worry about this moment, but this is exactly the moment why we need to have some people who have some sense of the history of where we've been.
And data.
And data.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue to what I'm thinking about, because the way that we can use this data that comes out of a women and gender-focused, dare I even say feminist and womanist research institute embedded within a women's college that already produces many women leaders, creates an incredible potential for an amplifier effect. Because not only does that institution recognize that this ability to produce this kind of data with these kind of perspectives has to be protected, but it also has a mechanism for infusing it into the future leaders. So that there's always this opportunity to make sure that the wheels keep grinding forward for women and for members of all kinds of social groups that we're talking about today. And that's, for me, why as the director of the Wellesley Center for Women, I'm always thinking about our next 50 years. You know, I say, wow, it's wonderful that we've had the privilege of surviving this long, because not all of the peer organizations that began in that era when you founded the Center for Research on Women have made it that far. Some, unfortunately, have either fallen by the wayside or been transformed into something that was very different than their original mission. But here we are now in this age of social media and the internet, needing good data more than ever, because people are becoming their own researchers. They're Googling everything and they're answering their own questions. And if good data isn't out front and center with the kind of perspectives that put a useful spin or, you know, context on it, then that leaves a lot more people lost. So I think that the equation in terms of how data and research gets circulated has changed across our 3 generations, and that it's as important as ever that we maintain the ability to keep that data going. All right, so let me just ask one more question before I turn it over.
May I make one point before
please,
you take
yes.
to the next?
Of course.
And that is, not only do we need the data, but we need people who are interested and involved to use it, to see it, to be actors.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I go back to the historic role of the Women's College, is where many of those leaders came from. Thank you.
Yes, and I appreciate that. I don't know if you all know, I'm also a graduate of a women's college, even though it wasn't Wellesley. I went to Spelman College in Atlanta, which is the leading black women's college, and I got that same kind of spirit about the power of women to make change and the power of women to do anything. So I very much appreciate what you're saying, and I really carry that passion about women's institutions as incubators for some of the most important social change that really liberates everyone. So I think we're all privileged to be a part of that. So the question that I want to end with before I turn it over to an audience who I'm sure has many questions of their own for both of you is, when you think about the future of the Wellesley Centers for Women and the future of the women's movement, what would you like to see, and in particular, how would you like to see the Wellesley Center for Women as an actor in those movements? What do you see as that potential?
Well, since I don't want to follow Barbara Newman, I'll have first. I think that we all see, you know, we've all seen women showing up to testify before congressional committees and so forth. I think that kind of outreach is very important, because there will be more women asking questions after this midterm election, please God, and there will be, you know, there should be women to answer those questions. The other thing that when we watch the internet and the way it informs, you know, one of the things I've been thinking about is podcasts. I don't think about podcasts at all. I don't listen to any podcasts. Podcasts scare me to death. I think the idea of if I were to get addicted to podcasts, then what would happen to me? But I think that you know, that does one of the things that you were exactly talking about. Have the data, put the data out there in, you know, available to all the people who Google, and then accompany it with the context in the form of podcasts. It's just, you know, there are all kinds of modern ways to communicate, and I think that would be one of the things that I would hope that the movement and the centers could do. But there still are some basic things, you know, that have to be handled. The discrimination of women in the workplace is a serious question. The abuse of women in the workplace, we've seen so much of in the last few weeks, very serious question. One of my close personal friends, one Nina Totenberg, who you think every man who ever tried to abuse her would have really regretted it. So she tried to explain to, you know, from our vantage point in the 70s to the young women who work at NPR who are in their 20s and 30s, she tried to explain that, you know, you can't just ruin a guy's career because he did something which was stupid and horrible, but he didn't know it was wrong, or he thought it was okay, and oh, they just went. Nina has been, she's been mending fences for about, I don't know, almost half a year since she made those remarks. But that is something that has changed, and I think young women are so militant about it that I can't see how it could. I don't think it will sink back in the way that some other issues have. I mean, if it does, it will be at peril of your life.
The durability of this horror that we're going through at the moment, I'm not sure of. I'm just not sure how deep it is. It is expanding our agenda markedly. I'm not sure whether it's the agenda for a women's center, but certainly the whole country is going to be looking at the fallout on this. I think the question of incorporating men as well as women in the dialogue is appropriate. And I think the Women's Center should look at some of, well, let me back. I don't want to mix these two. The period. Now let me go to the Women's Center. I think some of the more interesting work that has been done at the Women's Center is related to family home structure. And in my lifetime, the family structure has completely shifted. This is a very different world than the 4 kids in the suburbs. And the role of single parents, having been one in my life, is a very different existence, and I don't think we've really looked at all of the supports and needs and the impacts and whatnot. And again, I think the question of incorporation of men and women in some of this research is well taken. It's not my place at this juncture to say this is the direction you should go. I think the sense of the Women's Center is I want a body there that is flexible enough to meet what the needs are at a given time, and I want you to survive so that there is this reservoir. But I do think that there are, for example, when we established the Stone Center, and I had the very good luck of having sat in the president's office when the Stone family came forward with an idea of where they wanted to go and why they wanted to really look at questions of mental health and counseling and to change the way Wellesley did it and to really make a difference in adolescent health. That was a commitment we made. I want to make sure that commitment is honored. I feel that that is very distinctly, it has, and the center has done well at finding some links between issues of mental health and social issues. But I also want to make sure that while we work on mental health problems, which we have the commitment for, and God willing, God knows we need it, but also on some of the basic social policy issues of which include the individual and dignity of the individual in society and the nature of the economic structure. So you've got a major challenge ahead of you, friend. But hopes that as you structure it, you can meet both, keep one eye on this for these founding principles, but on the other, have the flexibility to meet needs at a given time.
Well, it's a good thing I have two eyes, one for each. Thank you. You know, what I really would like to just say in conclusion before we turn it over to the audience for questions is that these remarks by both President Newell and Linda Wertheimer point out that to make deep, durable, sustainable social change, you have to affect individual consciousness, you have to affect social institutions, and you have to affect the culture as a whole. If you don't affect all three of those at once, something will fall apart at some point in time. So thankfully we have that perspective, and with the good work of our researchers and our project directors, they plug in each at different parts of that equation, and in collaboration with our other partners in the wider society and other institutions, we're all collectively moving this forward. So let me turn it over now to you. You may have questions for the panel or for specific individuals. Who would like to be the first person to raise a question? All right, so then let's just thank our guests for this wonderful conversation.